Communists thought selfishness could be cast out of human nature. Russian revolutionaries spoke of the new Soviet man who wasn't motivated by self-interest. And those who resisted were attacked by an army of purifiers called the Red Guard, who went around the country putting dunce caps. The problem with communism, and with some very recent ideologies here at home, is that they think you can change reality by screaming at it.
8 years ago, I moved from San Francisco to Nashville after my rent doubled while homeless encampments grew outside my apartment. I thought I was alone in my frustration until I saw Bill Maher corner this CNN host about the exact same issues that drove me away. If you've ever questioned why Democratic cities are failing despite collecting massive tax revenue, you're about to see the rare moment a media figure can't spin away from reality. Maher doesn't just raise the questions, he demands answers about why liberal policies consistently fail the very people they claim to help. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great. Thank you so much. Now, back to the video. Americans are voting with their feet, and the exodus from Democratic strongholds is nothing short of staggering. Over 300,000 people fled New York last year alone, while California lost nearly 500,000 residents. But why are so many abandoning these once thriving cities? Bill Maher wasn't afraid to confront his CNN guest with the uncomfortable truth. Let's talk about what's really happening in Democratic-run cities. Maher began.
Thinking, old culture, old customs, and old habits. So, your whole life went in the garbage overnight, no biggie. And the only way to survive was to plead insanity for the crime of being insufficiently radical, then apologize and thank the state for the chance to see what a piece of shit you are, who didn't take to being a new kind of mortal being. A lot of pointing and shaming went on. Oh, and about 1 million dead.
Diving straight into the numbers. New York's state income tax up to 10.9%. California, a whopping 13.3% at the top bracket. Meanwhile, Florida charges zero, nothing. The CNN host nodded uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for such direct comparisons. But those high-tax states have unique challenges. The CNN personality countered weakly. More diverse populations, aging infrastructure, higher costs of living. His voice trailed off as Maher's expression made it clear he wasn't buying these excuses. Unique challenges? That's fascinating, Maher replied with that trademark raised eyebrow that signals he's about to demolish someone's argument. Because last time I checked, Florida has 22 million people from every background imaginable. They deal with hurricanes every year, and somehow they maintain better roads than New York while charging no income tax whatsoever. The CNN host shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't the softball interview he'd expected. Well, different priorities require different funding levels, he attempted. Maher wasn't having it. Different priorities? New York State has a $220 billion budget. That's more than Florida and Texas combined. Yet the New York subway system is literally crumbling. Homeless encampments are everywhere. Streets are dirty. Crime is up. Where exactly is all this money going? The studio grew uncomfortably quiet. This wasn't the usual partisan bickering. These were hard facts that couldn't be easily dismissed with talking points. The CNN host loosened his collar, visibly sweating now. You know what's amazing? Maher continued, leaning forward. The states with the highest taxes also have the worst results. California spends $17,700 per student on education, one of the highest rates in America, yet ranks 38th in educational outcomes. Meanwhile, Florida spends just $9,400 per student and achieves better results. The CNN host attempted one final defense. But these Democratic-run cities offer more comprehensive services, he argued. They're trying to create safety nets for vulnerable populations. Are they really? Maher fired back. New York City spends over $3.2 billion annually on homeless services. That's about $68,000 per homeless person. For that money, they could rent everyone a one-bedroom apartment and have cash left over. Instead, the problem gets worse every year. So I'll ask again, where is the money actually going? The tension in the studio was palpable. The audience sat in stunned silence as the CNN host struggled to formulate a response. After several uncomfortable seconds, he finally cracked. Look, I can't deny the numbers, he admitted reluctantly. Democratic cities are collecting enormous tax revenue and not delivering proportional services. The money isn't making it to where it's needed most. He looked down, avoiding eye contact with Maher. There's too much bureaucracy, too many special interests, too many hands in the pot. The audience gasped audibly. This wasn't some right-wing pundit making these claims. This was coming from a CNN host, admitting the failure of progressive governance on live television. The moment felt seismic, like witnessing a crack in the media establishment's carefully constructed narrative. So what you're saying, Maher pressed, sensing blood in the water, is that the democratic model of high taxation isn't actually helping the people it claims to serve. The CNN host sighed deeply. The evidence speaks for itself. We've promised that more government spending would solve these problems, but the cities with the highest spending have the worst outcomes. It's hard to argue with that reality. You could hear a pin drop in the studio. For viewers at home, this was a rare moment of honesty from a network not exactly known for criticizing democratic policies. Social media immediately exploded with clips of the exchange, with comments like, "Did hell just freeze over?" and "CNN finally tells the truth." That rare moment of honesty wasn't even the beginning of the CNN host's uncomfortable night. When Maher shifted the conversation to the housing crisis plaguing America's most progressive cities, the temperature in the studio dropped another few degrees. "Let's talk about San Francisco," Maher said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Remember when that was America's dream city? Now it's a nightmare of tent encampments and human suffering." The CNN host shifted nervously in his seat. He clearly knew where this was heading, but there was nowhere to hide as the cameras continued rolling. "Here's what I find fascinating," Maher continued, leaning forward with intensity. "The cities with the strictest regulations consistently have the worst homelessness problems and the most astronomical housing costs. Isn't that a bit suspicious to you?" The CNN contributor attempted to regain his footing with the standard talking points. "Well, Bill, market forces and income inequality are primarily responsible for the housing crisis. The wealthy are driving up prices in desirable areas and..." Maher cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Market forces? Really, that's the best you've got? Let me throw some numbers at you that your network seems allergic to reporting." Viewers at home could practically feel the tension as Maher pulled out a stack of notes. This wasn't the usual political banter. He had come armed with facts that were about to make his guest extremely uncomfortable. In San Francisco, it takes up to 18 months just to get a building permit approved. 18 months before you can even put a shovel in the ground, Maher exclaimed. Meanwhile, people are literally living and dying on the streets while bureaucrats shuffle papers. The CNN host attempted to interject, but Maher was on a roll. And that's just the beginning of the regulatory nightmare. In California, regulatory costs add between $100,000 to $200,000 to the price of every new housing unit. That's not coming from evil corporations or greedy landlords. That's coming directly from the policies your party champions. The audience gasped at the staggering figures. The CNN host's face had gone from uncomfortable to pale as he realized the corner he was being backed into. "Look at the contrast," Maher continued. "In Texas and Florida, where regulations are more reasonable, housing remains relatively affordable. Construction happens quickly. People can actually find places to live without winning the lottery or inheriting a fortune." The CNN host finally managed to get a word in, but those Republican solutions just favor wealthy developers over ordinary people. They cut corners on safety and environmental protections. Maher pounced. "Oh, please! Is it favoring ordinary people to make housing so expensive that only the ultra-wealthy can afford it? Is it protecting the environment when endless environmental reviews force working families into 2-hour commutes from the suburbs, pumping tons more carbon into the atmosphere?" The studio audience erupted in applause. Even in liberal Los Angeles, the painful reality of the housing crisis had touched nearly everyone. "Let's call this what it is," Maher said, his voice rising. "Pure hypocrisy. Your party claims to care about the poor and homeless while implementing policies that make it virtually impossible to build the affordable housing they desperately need. These aren't unintended consequences. These are predictable results of prioritizing regulatory purity over human needs." The CNN host looked increasingly desperate. "We need regulations to ensure quality housing. What people need is somewhere to actually live," Maher shot back. Your policies have made that impossible for them. The cities with the most progressive leadership have the worst homelessness crises. How is that helping anyone? The exchange had reached its boiling point. The CNN host looked down at his notes, then back up at Maher, and in a moment that would soon go viral across the internet, he finally cracked. "You know what? You're right," he admitted, his voice suddenly quieter. "The regulatory burden in our major cities has become excessive, and it's preventing the construction of affordable housing. I can't deny that anymore." The studio fell silent. Even Maher seemed momentarily stunned by the candid admission. "Our intentions may have been good," the CNN contributor continued, "but the results speak for themselves. We've created a system where it's nearly impossible to build housing for ordinary people in the cities that need it most." The housing market bombshell had barely landed when Maher decided to twist the knife even deeper. While school boards are busy debating pronouns and bathroom policies, American kids can't even read at grade level anymore, he declared, pulling out a chart that visibly rattled the CNN host. You could practically see the color drain from his face as the numbers revealed an educational catastrophe that couldn't be spun or deflected. 8th grade reading scores have hit a 30-year low, Maher announced, his voice rising with genuine concern. Let that sink in. 3 decades of supposed progress, and our kids are reading worse than their parents did in the early 90s. How exactly does the party that brands itself as champions of education explain these results? The CNN host shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unprepared for this frontal assault on what Democrats had long considered their home turf. "Well, Bill, these statistics don't tell the whole story," he stammered. "Many of these struggling districts face unique challenges: poverty, underfunding, systemic inequalities that Republican policies have only made worse." Maher wasn't having any of it. "Underfunding, really? That's the defense you're going with?" He pulled out another chart showing educational spending across major cities. These Democratic strongholds are spending more per student than almost anywhere else in the country, yet they're producing some of the worst outcomes. Something doesn't add up here. The audience murmured as the disconnect became impossible to ignore. How could cities spending astronomical amounts on education be failing so spectacularly at their most basic mission? "Let me offer an alternative explanation," Maher continued, leaning forward. "Maybe it's not about how much money you're throwing at the problem, but what you're actually teaching. In district after district, we've seen traditional academic fundamentals replaced with curriculum focused on social justice initiatives." The CNN host attempted to interject, but Maher was on a roll. "I'm all for teaching kids about equality and fairness. These are important values, but not at the expense of reading, writing, and arithmetic. You can't navigate the world or fight for justice if you can't even read at grade level." The conversation grew more heated as Maher raised another uncomfortable question. Why are teacher unions so adamantly opposed to performance metrics? They fight tooth and nail against any attempt to measure teacher effectiveness, yet they're perfectly fine with mandatory training on ideological issues. Shouldn't teaching kids how to read come before teaching them about gender theory? This direct challenge left the CNN host visibly flustered. "That's an unfair characterization," he protested weakly. "Teacher unions are protecting educators from being unfairly evaluated based on factors outside their control." That's when Maher played his trump card. "Let's talk about charter schools," he said calmly. "These schools, operating in the exact same neighborhoods with students from the same communities, are achieving dramatically better results across the board. Higher graduation rates, better test scores, more college admissions. But charter schools can cherry-pick their students," the CNN host objected, grasping for any defense. "Many charter schools admit by lottery," Maher countered. "Same kids, same neighborhoods, same funding, but different results. The only significant difference is they're not constrained by the same bureaucracy and union rules. They can innovate, demand excellence, and focus on academics rather than ideology." Man, the CNN host looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing a rare moment of political truth-telling on national television. "Look," Maher said, softening his tone slightly, "nobody's saying the Democrats don't care about education, but at some point you have to judge policies by their results, not their intentions, and the results are catastrophic." The tension in the studio was palpable as the host finally cracked under the weight of undeniable evidence. I think we may have lost our way on this issue," he admitted reluctantly. There's been an institutional shift away from academic achievement toward ideological goals, and while those goals might be well-intentioned, they've come at a terrible cost to the very students we claim to be helping. And that's how it ended, with a CNN host backed into a corner finally admitting what millions of Americans already know. This rare moment of truth-telling on mainstream media exposed the painful reality that Democratic policies have utterly failed in our major cities. The evidence was simply too overwhelming to deny. What makes this exchange so powerful is that it didn't come from a right-wing commentator, but from Bill Maher, a lifelong liberal who simply couldn't ignore the facts anymore. As Maher himself put it, the emperor has no clothes, and it's time we all admitted it. His call for political honesty cut through the usual partisan noise. This watershed moment explains why we're witnessing the great migration from blue to red states. People aren't moving because of political ideology. They're escaping the unlivable conditions created by failed progressive experiments. When basic necessities like affordable housing, decent education, and safe streets disappear, people vote with their feet. The most telling part, even CNN couldn't spin this reality anymore. Sometimes the truth is just too obvious to deny.